So I actually was doing stem cell cultures in 1967. So that's 40 years ago. Well, people think oh, stem cells are this brand new thing. It's like, no, no, stem cells have been around for a long time, except a very exclusive club studying them. And the beautiful part about my stem cell research was as I started to do this and I was cloning genetically identical cells, I started to realize that if I would take these genetically identical cells and put them into separate petri dishes and then change the environment in those dishes, that in one dish they will form muscle, in another dish they'll form bone, and yet in a third dish they would form fat by changing the conditions. You stop for a second and realize, well, wait, they're all genetically identical. So what is it that controlled why they became muscle or bone or fat? And the answer was very obvious. It was like information from the environment. So this started to lead me on a different trail than all my colleagues who were getting focused on the genome and building up the background to create the Genome Project while I was doing this. So I was taking the road less traveled at that time. I was looking into the role of how the environment influences the expression of cells while everyone else was looking at how genes control cells. And yet my papers were published in very prestigious journals. And the results were very clear. It wasn't even ambiguous. It was that the fate of the cells was primarily determined by the environment that cells find themselves in. So when I published this, I was of course very excited by this, but then found myself to be a very small crowd of one in my community because I had violated mind you, what is called the central dogma. The central dogma is the pillar of modern biomedicine today. It was a concept that was coined by Francis Crick, the guy, one of the co-discoverers with Jim Watson of the DNA double helix. And the central dogma simply says this, and you're very familiar with it, is that the flow of information in biology goes from DNA to RNA to protein. And this is established in all the textbooks. It's still in all the textbooks at this very moment. So it says information flows from DNA down. And therefore, since your body, which is made out of protein, and the proteins are coded for by the DNA, then we have bought the belief, as the dogma says, that your fate and your lot in life is determined by the genes you receive at conception. So we become victims of our heredity in this sense, if you understand it from this point, that you didn't pick your genes and you can't change your genes, and since your genes control your life, then you're a victim to those particular genes. That is the message that conventional science has been teaching. And the issue is that's totally false. So as you understand the terms quantum physics and quantum mechanics, or Newtonian physics and Newtonian mechanics, what you see is that physics and mechanics are synonyms. So physics really means the mechanisms by which the universe operates. And the new physics, quantum physics, was something that I really wasn't into, nor were any of my colleagues in the medical school. We were all trained in Newtonian physics. And the difference between the two is very profound. Newtonian physics says the world that we live in, the universe we live in, is a machine made out of mechanical parts. If you want to understand how it works, take it apart, study the pieces, change the operation. That's the basis of medicine. We look at a human body, it's a machine made out of physical parts. When it's not working right, change the parts by buying chemicals and drugs. And that's the way that conventional medicine operates. When I started to read the quantum physics, I realized, oh my goodness, the whole foundation of the universe is not based on a mechanical, physical universe. It's based on the invisible energy called the field. So let's say if I hold a magnet right here in front of you, and you can see the magnet, but what you can't see is the invisible magnetic field. And so what it says is, well, we are physical things in our world, like physical bodies. We're immersed in fields, electromagnetic fields, magnetic fields itself, all kinds of fields like telephone, cell phone fields, television fields, radio fields, whole ranges. What is the difference between the Newtonian physics and quantum physics is this. Newtonian physics focus on the particles. Quantum physics says, you want to understand why the particles take this shape? Then you have to understand the field. It's the field that controls biology. It's the invisible forces. There's a great quote by Albert Einstein, and it's simple. It goes, the field is the sole governing agency of the particle. In other words, in the world of invisible things, fields, and particles, matter, it's the field that gives shape to the matter. And this is the basis of quantum physics. This becomes relevant. It says, okay, here's the physical particles of my body. Why are they in a healthy state, or why could they be in a sick state? That's the physical expression. And the answer is, well, to understand that, don't look at the body. You have to understand the invisible forces in the field. And it's fun, because if you think about it, of course, when you were young, at some point you must have had like iron filings and sprinkled it around a magnet, and all of a sudden you saw the iron filings form that pattern of the magnetic field. Well, quantum physics would look at this pattern and try to explain how come all the iron filings fell in this pattern without recognizing that the field exists. In other words, can you explain why the iron filings have this shape if you don't recognize the magnetic field? And the answer is absolutely not. What's the nature of it? The body and its cells are like iron filings. Medicine is trying to understand the nature of the body by looking at the iron filings. And quantum physics says, if you don't understand that invisible field, you can't understand what's happening in the body. And then you say, well, what does this field constitute? Well, it's what is called the matrix, which is an interesting word because Max Planck, one of the founders of quantum physics, talked about this invisible shaping field and gave it the name the matrix. And that, of course, has been used in the movie. And in fact, people have talked about this matrix. Some people refer to it as the divine matrix. My friend Greg Braden, who wrote a book about that, meaning not only is this the invisible field, the energy field, but it's equivalent to many people what is God and spirit. Okay? So invisible forces, whether you use the physics context and talk about invisible forces as fields, or you use the spiritual context that says the invisible forces are spirit, the spirit and the field at least represent the same thing in modern science. So science is bringing the spiritual concept of invisible forces into play into the physical world that was left out by Newtonian physics. Conventional allopathic medicine is completely locked into Newtonian physics. Doesn't even bring the mind into the concept of healing, which is interesting because they actually, in a medical education, medical students get about 15 minutes in their entire academic career of a thing called the placebo effect. And the placebo effect is simply the mind can change the character of health. In other words, if you believe that this drug is the miracle drug you've been looking for and you take it, your mind believing it's the miracle drug can heal you, while the drug itself was nothing more than a sugar pill. And now that's an established fact. 1/3 of all medical healings are due to the placebo effect. Okay? It becomes very important. Now comes, well, we left something out of the picture in the education. Not that it's out of the picture in the research, but in the education it says the placebo effect is when you have positive thoughts and it generates a healing response. What they don't talk about in the books and in the general mass media is something called the nocebo effect. The nocebo effect is the same as the placebo effect, except the thoughts are of a negative nature. And what's the point? It's thoughts that are powerful, whether they're positive or negative. And while we give attention to the positive thoughts, called placebo effect, creating healing, what we know and what we don't talk about is that a negative thought, which constitutes what is called a nocebo effect, is as powerful as a placebo, but in the opposite direction. So a negative thought can not only make you sick, a negative thought can kill you in much the exact same power and using the same mechanism that a positive placebo thought can heal you. And this becomes important because psychologists tell us that 70% or more of our thoughts as conventional people are negative and redundant, meaning every day, 70% of people's thoughts are actually taking health away from their lives and actually bringing less quality to their lives, and they don't count it because it's just that little thought that runs in their head, and yet, scientifically, it's the equivalent of the placebo effect, but backwards. So this has to come into medicine, but there's an unfortunate part about medicine, and that is medicine is not really the free avenue of research and investigation as we think it is. It is controlled by money, and unfortunately this is where the pharmaceutical industry has undue influence and keeps us from looking at healing that does not involve chemicals and drugs. only for the simple reasons this. A pharmaceutical company makes money by selling chemicals. If we talk about how you can heal yourself with your mind, then that product doesn't sell very well. And there's a parallel here, because let's look at it very obvious. We live in a world where there are many other forms of providing energy besides fossil fuel, many of them very efficient, much more effective. Where are they? And the answer is, it's not in the interest of the oil companies to support free energy, sources of power. And it's the same thing with medicine. It's not in the interest of the pharmaceutical industry to support free energy healing. And therefore, it's a subject that gets no coverage except for that 15 minutes on the placebo and then dropped out of the system. And yet it is the most important new understanding, and it's not new because it's 100 years old or more. It's new only because we're beginning to look at it in spite of the fact that drug companies don't want us to see it. The problem with the concept of power, the power of positive thinking, is people just think, oh, well, if I just have positive thoughts, then my life should be affected. And this is why positive thinking has a real bad rap in the public. And the reason is this. Having a positive thought does not in any way necessitate that those positive thoughts actually manifest themselves. And there's a piece that was left out. And if you don't understand the piece, then you're shouting into the wind with your positive thoughts. Nothing's going to happen. And the fact is this. When you're having positive thoughts, you're using your mind. The new biology reveals that the invisible forces that collectively we refer to as mind, that these form a field which shape biology. Well, here's what's important. Yes, the mind influences biology, but there are two parts to the mind that are completely different than one another, yet they work together. We confuse them, we tie them together, and yet they represent two entities working in two different fashions. There's the conscious mind and what is called the subconscious mind. Now, here's what it's very important. People have to know this, okay? And here's what it is. The conscious mind is our creative mind that is connected to our personal identity and our spiritual selves. That makes us all unique. Each of us has our own personal conscious mind. But what becomes very significant is this, is the subconscious mind is equivalent to a tape player. It's exactly what it is. It records experiences and then plays them back. And so now let's take a look and say, well, wait, there's a thinking mind, and then there's a tape player mind. And what's different about them is very profound. So let's talk about two fundamental differences first. The tape player, the subconscious mind, as an information processor, as the equivalent of a computer, is 1,000,000 times more powerful an information processor than is the conscious mind. So when you look at the power between the conscious and subconscious is 1,000,000 times more powerful. Number two, on a day-by-day basis, the subconscious mind runs our biology about 95 to 99% of the time. So while you're having all these wonderful thoughts, that's not the conscious mind's not running the show. It's a subconscious mind. Then comes the issue is, well, the subconscious mind got programs in it. Yes. And the subconscious mind is not evil or good. The subconscious mind is a tape player. As much as you can say, okay, here's a tape player. It's good or bad. The tape player is not good or bad. The programs can be good, and the programs can be bad. So blaming the subconscious mind as a negative thing, that's the first mistake. It's a tape player. The programs that we got, that's the source of the problems that most of us face. And these programs could limit our abilities and take away our powers, which essentially they do. Now, the relevance about positive thinking is this. Positive thinking is a creative thought that comes from the conscious mind. Okay, so I sit here and I'm going to have all these wonderful thoughts. I'm going to close my eyes and visualize all these wonderful things. Now stop and go back to the mechanical character of it. I'm having these thoughts with a little tiny processor called the conscious mind, and I'm competing with the programs that are in the subconscious mind. So if I have a thought for being healthy or being in a good relationship, and I'm doing positive thinking, and at the same time I have acquired programs in my development that said you're not as healthy as you think you are, and you're not that good a person to have those kind of relationships, then look, I'm now pitting my positive thoughts against my programs, and they're opposite.